to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This is the first occasion my right honourable friend and I have had to debate an element of his new portfolio in public. It is a subject to which I have devoted much of my time over the last 5 years. And I want to put my right honourable friend at his ease. I, of all people, know he has one of the toughest jobs in government. And I suspect his willingness to go out and bat for the government on the most difficult of wickets is one of the reasons he was chosen for these responsibilities. I don't want to draw him onto ground where he has to defend the indefensible this evening. Instead, I'm going to use most of this brief debate to, as best I can, make the case for his positive intervention in a narrow but profoundly important and potentially positive part of his responsibilities. I don't want or expect an answer this evening. These matters demand careful consideration. There will be an application to the Backbench Business Committee supported by over a score of colleagues from across the House for a fuller consideration shortly. I hope by the time that debate is secured, we can enjoy the news that this Minister is taking the available opportunities of his very tough policy inheritance. Global drug policy. Since the United States, directed by the FBI of Henry Anslinger under J. Edgar Hoover, corralled the world into agreeing the 1961 UN Convention on Comprehensive Narcotic Prohibition. It has a decent claim to be the greatest failure in public policy since 1945. The casualties and costs certainly are cumulative, much greater than any conflicts of the period. In the future, historians will look back on the policy of the USA in stunned wonderment that having had a decade and a half of prohibition of alcohol in their own country, they thought it sensible less than 30 years later to press the rest of the world to prohibit everything but alcohol and tobacco and expect a different outcome. This time, the scale was truly epic on the entire world and everything humans had come to use to make themselves feel better. Driven by the same moral certainty that underpinned the temperance movement decades earlier, the scale of the cost and the toll of casualties should have been entirely predictable. So great has been the investment in this policy around the world, the moral high ground of the political class, the blood price paid by state security forces around the world, that it seems it is only retired leaders who engage properly in this first-order debate and, based on their experience, now challenge the assumptions upon which they governed. Today's leaders face the particular problem of explaining to their electorates why the certainties on which a self-evidently failing policies are based are in fact a mirage. The black and white simplicities that lend themselves to ease of political communication don't exist. They must also begin to put in place an alternative and more effective answer to reduce the harm done to humanity by narcotics than the simplicity of blanket prohibition. This will be complex and difficult and will require communication skills and moral courage of an exceptional order. This global reordering will be for the future. The sooner we get there, the sooner the carnage can stop, and the cost and benefits of our policy be measured properly, with a degree of disinterested academic rigour so absent over the last half-century. What policymakers can do immediately is address the most obvious and damaging consequences of prohibition, where access to medicine has been lost and denied. Forgone medical treatment is just one element of the cost of blanket narcotic prohibition, but it is very great once we understand the treatments we have denied ourselves amidst the moral panic underpinning prohibition. To no class of drugs is this urgent repair more needed than the psychedelics. First, the opportunity for a major step change in mental health treatment is real. We are not talking here about simply improving the treatment of symptoms of mental ill health. We have the opportunity with the psychedelic class of compounds to make a step change in mental health and, with a proper regard for the actual risks involved, drive access to medicines while facilitating the collection of data for their efficacy in the real world. As ministers around the world are now becoming aware, psychedelics, including psilocybin, are being investigated and are being found to have promising application as facilitators of psychotherapy for the treatment of the most debilitating and devastating mental health conditions suffered by people around the world. Unlike the treatment options currently available to patients, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy does not foster dependence. Instead, it treats the underlying causes of mental ill health rather than simply covering their symptoms through emotional blunting. Unlike selective serotonin ray uptake inhibitors, SSRIs, antidepressants, on which patients can come to rely for decades and to which they have no real alternative. My honourable friend for devices is probably concerned about freeing people from the overuse and dependence on these treatments. And in seeking his support for the application of the Backbench Business Committee, he cautioned me to stay by enthusiasm until we have solved this problem as the first priority. But that misses the point, that assisted psychotherapy can give patients their lives back, escaping antidepressants in the first place by allowing them to form and enjoy satisfying relationships with other people, to return to and thrive at work or study and contribute fully to society, or even better, cope with end of life as they help patients confront their fear of death. It really is revolutionary and has the potential to dramatically improve the lives of millions of our fellow citizens. We must do both. Addressing the missed opportunity of treatment over half a century will help address the miserable dependence of too many on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, known as SSRIs, and it would be untenable for the government to keep barriers into cancer research, for example. This should also be the case for psychedelics in their promise to mental health. Of course.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way and for securing this important debate. I just wanted to ask him about the number of people living with treatment-resistant depression in the UK. Does he have any kind of estimate of how many people that might be and what the cost could be to the economy of not rescheduling psilocybin as he proposes?
Crispin Blunt.
Well, the cost is enormous. If one considers there are 1.2 million people suffering depression, the number of those people who go on to commit suicide, who could be treated, those armed servicemen who have come back from their active service in Afghanistan and Iraq, a third of whom, approximately, are beyond treatment for the trauma that they have sustained. And of all people, who does the state owe a debt? And so the scale of the cost of this issue is actually enormous. So how do we get into this position? There was 20 years of documented medical research prior to the scientific blackout that followed the stringent terms of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. How did awareness of the therapeutic potential of psychedelics not weigh in the balance to have avoided the situation we are in today, where they are so tightly controlled that even researchers at UK world-class universities struggle to access them for research purposes? It is an unhappy accident of history that the government regulations for controlled drugs in the 1970s has impacted the public in ways that were completely unforeseen. These extremely safe drugs are in the most stringently controlled class and schedule, based not only on any historic or contemporary assessment of their toxicity or dangers, but simply that there were no submissions made to British or American regulators of medical products containing psilocybin before the instatement of the UN Single Convention through the UK's Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971. They were therefore assumed to be worthless for medicine. The historic use of cocaine and heroin in medicine prior to 1971 accounts why these drugs, with far, far higher dangers and awful potential for abuse, reside within a lower schedule than the much more benign psilocybin and its fellow psychedelics.
Thank Dr. Brown for Reigate for allowing my intervention. I'm curious, I wonder if he agrees with me that we're in danger here of taking psilocybin into the same arena as we've now put medical cannabis, where the medical profession blames politicians and politicians blames the medical profession. And rather than them all looking for obstacles, we should be trying to look for some constructive solutions.
My honourable friend, with whom I have learnt so much over the last 5 years, and also with the honourable lady for Warrington South, who has joined in this debate with personal testimony at the most enormous strength. And I know he's had conversations with the Minister, and I thank the Minister for making time for these conversations and for learning. It is the Minister to whom inevitably we now look for positive leadership in this space. And it's why I don't want to push him this evening. I could have spoken for 5 minutes and then left him swinging on the hook, where we could beat him all around the chamber on the trying to defend the indefensible of how we got into this position. I don't want to do that. I want this debate to be a positive contribution to lay out the challenge, why I believe we're having to respond in this way, and to give the Minister the room for manoeuvre to actually come forward with really positive answers about all the opportunities that there are within this policy.
On that point,
I'm happy to give way to John.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? We may have some differences of opinion in this, but the one thing I am very much aware of is my constituent, young Sophie Gibson, and her mother, Danielle. The previous minister back in the previous administration was the person who enabled wee Sophie to get medicinal cannabis and helped that wee girl stop the fits that she had, and today her family and she's having a better standard of life. While I understand that sometimes steps have to be taken, I would also caution perhaps, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we don't move forward until we're absolutely sure that there may be no side effects of what happens. In Sophie's case, it worked, but it won't work in every case.
Crispin Blunt.
Of course, I listen with care to the Honourable Gentleman and thank him for attending this debate, and of course the cause of his constituents that he championed. And it is part of the piece. Behind this consideration of psychedelics does sit consideration of cannabis as a medicine, and indeed it's a wellness treatment. And there is a huge economic as well as a health opportunity there as well. They are not completely unrelated, and his points are well made, but we don't want to get ourselves into a place where we have so much anxiety about risk, where risk does not really exist in reality, that we then create blocks for progress. And this is where we need to come back to the historic context that led to the irrationality of the position that we're in. And that, of course, was the thalidomide crisis. This tightened a number of regulations concerning the testing of investigational drugs. The commendable intent of these regulations was to ensure that drugs came to the market safe and effective. Double-blind, randomised, placebo-controlled trials became the gold standard for testing emerging medicines. But because psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is ultimately a form of psychotherapy rather than a drug treatment in the traditional sense, strict adherence to these standards proves close to impossible to meet. The story of the psychedelics is thus one of an extremely promising treatment modality that was lost in discussion over how to understand and evaluate therapeutic treatment effectiveness. The primitive design of psychedelic trials in the 50s and 60s, as well as a lack of flexibility in how regulators evaluated more traditional pharmaceutical interventions, ultimately led to psychedelic-assisted therapies falling below the cutoff for approval as market-authorised medicines. These drugs were completely novel to researchers and regulators. They troubled the distinction between biological psychiatry, with its pharmacological interventions, the psychological arm of psychiatry, and its psychotherapies. Given the novelty of the way these treatments work and the virtual impossibility of designing placebo controls for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, no wonder the trials of these drugs didn't meet the standards of the regulators, remaining faithful to the standards used to test pharmaceutical interventions on their own. These treatments are fundamentally forms of psychotherapy and need to be tested as such. A flexible and intelligent capacity to measure the efficacy of a drug which facilitates psychotherapy was simply not yet present in the culture of the regulators of the time. With the stigma surrounding them, fueling the tabloid appetite for excitable exaggeration, misinformation abounded about these mysterious mind-altering substances that appear to belong to the indigenous communities in remote jungles. So surely there was nothing to learn here. I think in the decades since we've learned a great deal about learning from experiences elsewhere in the world. In reality, death and injury rates, both physical and psychological, from unadulterated psychedelics are extremely low. Teams of researchers from the United States, from the UK, from the EU and from Australia have consistently found the psychedelics to be of the lowest possible harm potential of all the controlled drugs to both user and society. These studies considered the physiological toxicity of these drugs and other risks. But these drugs are best administered within supportive psychotherapeutic environments. That reduces the risks yet further. The medical research shows that when administered in these settings, psychedelics are associated with very positive psychotherapeutic outcomes. For example, research by Robin Carhart-Harris and others in 2016 showed significant decrease in depressive symptoms for up to 6 months, and this in a cohort already suffering from treatment-resistant depression. Research by Ross and others in 2016 showed significant decreases in anxiety and depression. Research by Johnson and others in 2014 showed 80% of the cohort were abstinent from smoking following treatment with psilocybin. Mental health harm costs the UK economy an estimated more than £110 billion a year annually, a staggering 5% of our gross domestic product. Smoking alone costs the economy £14.7 billion per year, £2.5 billion of which falls to the National Health Service. Even if psychedelics were to play a small role in improving outcomes in these areas, given their impact on society and the economy, the impact would be huge. The safety of these drugs has been firmly demonstrated too. There are now phase 3 trials underway, meaning that safety is well enough established in healthy and clinical populations that regulators are allowing research into their effectiveness in clinical treatment. Psilocybin and the other psychedelics have been well enough established as safe, all but unquestioned within the scientific and medical literature, and when administered under the supervision of trained professionals in suitably controlled environments, we move from a risk range from minimal to very significant benefit. The method of achieving and extent of the maximum benefit for patients is yet to be established, but there is every indication it will be remarkable compared to the psychotherapy unassisted by pharmacology, or where today's pharmacological assistance of antidepressants, from which a depressing, please excuse the pun, Mr. Deputy Speaker, number of patients now need withdrawal services, as my honourable friend for devices is campaigning to address. Research methods have matured since Prohibition, so the best and easiest way to obtain information on how effective psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies will be in the real world is to establish research and access to prescribing physicians and researchers. But we are already falling behind. The potential has been identified across the world, and to our embarrassment, as a nation committed to both science, entrepreneurship, and sustaining one of the world's great financial sectors, not only has $7 billion been raised on the markets of North America to invest in this emerging bioscience technology compared to very little raised here, our scientists, having largely owned this knowledge within the United Kingdom, are now following that investment. The market for psychedelic substances is projected to grow from $2 billion in 2020 to $10.75 billion by 2027. Facilitating the investigation of these drugs in this way would have allowed the United Kingdom to become the leading country in the study of the therapeutic potential of the psychedelic class of drugs and simultaneously facilitate access to patients. Hopefully, it is not too late. But unless this science is noisily supported and championed in the UK, it will be too late for the United Kingdom to make its proper contribution in this area. The use of psilocybin and other psychedelics in psychiatry is of even greater medical and scientific significance than simply their commercial promise. Yet the government is still wanting to evaluate the evidence regarding safety, scheduling, classification, and to add insult to injury, it seems at the moment it will only do so following a successful application for medical formulation containing psilocybin to the MHRA. In practice, there appear to be 3 routes to the rescheduling of the substance within the Misuse of Drugs Regulation of 2001, of which the Home Office seems at the moment wedded to one, rescheduling being triggered following a market authorisation by the MHRA. The more evidence-based route, a self-commissioned review by the ACMD, is effectively ruled out because of the ACMD's lack of funding and capacity. The simple third route is for the Minister in the Home Office to take the initiative and commission such a review of evidence with a view to rescheduling from the ACMD. The Minister, had I given him time, would no doubt have referred to his commissioning of the ACMD to investigate barriers to researching substances controlled under Schedule 1, and especially psilocybin, which I welcome. Forgive me for offering him time to further reflect before responding to colleagues and just me. In July 2017, the then Home Secretary commissioned a review of the barriers to research caused by drugs designated to Schedule 1, only for the long-term recommendations of the ACMD to be rejected. The current review has already been ongoing since 2020. Is this delay without cost? Cross-party members of this House have provided to me and others, including the Home Office, a proposal for the Minister to resolve the issue safely based on evidence in a very short space of time. Indeed, when cannabis-based products for medicinal use were rescheduled in 2018, it took a mere 12 weeks. When the evidence and need are so overwhelming, just like it was for cannabis-based products for medicinal use, for what reason can the government wait to take decisive action? The letter of the laws which govern use in medicine and science of these controlled substances were originally designed to be flexible and permissive. And as I understand it, nearly 2 years ago, when the then Prime Minister endorsed advice from his policy unit to get this done, the Home Office dived for the weeds of process around an application for medicine before contemplating changing scheduling or classification. I've asked the Home Office on 3 occasions by written parliamentary question whether they have in their possession any evidence that supports the current scheduling of psilocybin. I'm wholly certain the answer is none. The MHRA, the FDA, the Australian TGA, the UK Science and Research Community all know there isn't. Every day we do not act to support and enable the efforts of UK researchers. We hinder the progress of science and put what were our globally renowned research institutions at a growing disadvantage. But perhaps most scandalously of all, this delay in the science now will be delay in the medicine deployed and the therapeutics established on the basis of those medicines. 1.2 million people with depression in the UK will continue to provide the Grim Reaper with 18 suicides a day. Our untreatable, traumatised soldiers from their active service in Iraq and Afghanistan will continue to self-medicate with alcohol and other unsupervised drugs to the misery of themselves and their families. Addiction will be treated less effectively. Anxiety will not be addressed as it could. This pain and the scale of the economic cost to our country demanded action this day a long time ago. And all I've heard is to reinforce the hope that this minister will be the one to break the logjam. To act in such a way would be in direct accord with the government's own 10-year drugs plan, which aims to put evidence at the heart of drug policy. Behind the issue of the psychedelics, practically and intellectually, the easiest part of the drug policy thicket, sits the possibility of a legal cannabis and hemp industry too, with huge economic and environmental positives to secure. The chance to seize this low-hanging fruit and reap the rewards presents itself to this minister, this Home Secretary and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has begun the machinery of government changes that should enable so many departmental ministers, as yet unrepresented in the councils and the committee that in effect control our nation's drug policy, to make a reality of the opportunity. And if we make a reality of policy based on evidence, we can finally start to right the wrongs of 60 years of policy failure. This minister has a historic opportunity to radically improve the lives of millions of his fellow citizens, whilst also helping the United Kingdom lead the way as a world leader in medical research. Current drug policy has produced far more victims than successes. He can begin to reverse that.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In the short time I have available, let me just start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Reigate, for securing this debate and for the thoughtful, knowledgeable and carefully considered manner in which he delivered his speech. I should also, I think, recognise the honourable member for Warrington South, who I can see is in her place, who I know also has a very deep personal interest in this topic. And we had a meeting, a detailed meeting on this topic just a few days ago, so I'm delighted to see her in the chamber as well. Of course, when it comes to questions concerning the availability of medicines and prescribing, that is led by the Department for Health and Social Care, as medicines are licensed and regulated by the MHRA, but the Home Office is of course responsible for controlled drugs legislation and our controlled drugs licensing regime to support research and clinical trials in the UK, which is why it's me rather than a Department of Health Minister appearing here this evening. I think it's worth saying that I am very keen to encourage as far as we possibly can, research into the use of drugs in the UK. We have a very internationally well-regarded research sector, both in universities and, of course, in commercial pharmaceutical companies. And I think it could be a great source of national competitive advantage to make research projects by them as straightforward as possible. Now, of course, drugs that are scheduled in Schedule 1 can be used for research purposes, but with a licence. And I know that there are some people, and I discussed this with a member for Warrington South a few days ago, who feel that particularly for universities and for NHS trusts, feel that the process to go through to obtain that licence can be quite onerous. Clearly, for drugs scheduled in Schedules 2 and higher, those restrictions don't apply in the same way. So I am very aware of that point about research. I'm also very aware, as the Honourable Member for Reigate said, that in considering whether there are medical benefits that would support the rescheduling of drugs from Schedule 1 into Schedule 2 or higher, because they might enable patients to be prescribed them for medical purposes, you need a research base to do that. And I accept there is some element of chicken and egg or catch-22 about this, in that you need to do the research before there is an evidence base to justify the rescheduling that might be merited. And so, as the Honourable Member for Reigate said, I received the ACMD, the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs, Part 1 advice on reducing barriers to research with controlled drugs, which focused specifically on synthetic cannabinoids. And in December of last year, so just a few weeks ago, I formally commissioned them to conduct Part 2 of its review, which is designed to consider, which is intended and will consider, research with Schedule 1 drugs more widely. And of course, that includes LSD and MDMA. And in my letter to the ACMD commissioning that work, I specifically highlighted psilocybin, because of course it would be open to the government, depending on the ACMD's advice, to change the research rules to say that all Schedule 1 drugs might be capable of being used for research purposes without the onerous requirements that currently apply, in the same way that currently happens with Schedule 2 drugs and higher, or some variation of that. There's obviously quite a lot of policy detail one would have to consider. But were that move to be made, then clearly it would address the barriers to research that the Honourable Member for Reigate highlighted. And were those barriers to research to be removed, the evidence base could then be developed, which might provide a basis for the MHRA to then make a case that they should be moved to Schedule 2 or more, which would then facilitate, obviously, doctors to prescribe these drugs to patients who needed them. So I think the Honourable Member for Reigate very kindly said he wasn't going to press me too hard, given I'm relatively new in this position. I think the comments I've just made do suggest there is a path forward. I do strongly support making it as easy as possible for UK institutions, both universities, hospitals and private companies, to conduct research using not just psilocybin but all drugs. There's clearly a commercial as well as an academic benefit. So I'm looking forward to receiving that ACMD advice as soon as possible, and I can certainly assure the Honourable Member for Reigate, the Member for Warrington South and others that when that is received, it'll receive my prompt and positive attention. I think the Chair is indicating we're almost out of time, but I'm sure we can speak briefly afterwards. And Mr Deputy Speaker, on that point, I will rest.
Question is that this House do now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order.